Afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us. My name is Traci Thomas Card, and I am the Advocate Support and Grant Manager here at Standpoint. My role today is to help facilitate this webinar. If you have questions during the presentation, please type your question into the chat, and Jay or I will pass the question along to our presenter, Alyssa. Most of you probably know about our organization already, but for those that listen to this later and those that don't know, Standpoint is a statewide organization. We're a team of attorneys and advocates working to assist individuals who have experienced domestic violence, sexual violence, and trafficking when it includes domestic or sexual violence. We also provide assistance to systems professionals who work with survivors. We do this by facilitating trainings and answering calls to our action line. Examples of trainings we do are the annual New Laws training throughout the state of Minnesota, monthly webinars for advocates, and other trainings by request. Our action line and text service is answered Monday through Friday from 9 a.m. to 4 p.m. It's through our action line that our attorneys provide legal advice to survivors, and our advocates connect callers with resources, safety plans, listen, and help callers identify possible options and next steps. This webinar is being recorded, and you can check it out on Standpoint's YouTube page. The link to the recording will also be emailed out to Standpoint's Legal Advocates listserv after the webinar. For today's presentation, we've put in the chat box the link to the PowerPoint if that would be helpful for you to follow along with. Our topic for today's webinar is LGBTQ+ inclusion for service providers. I am honored to introduce our presenter. Alyssa joined Outfront Minnesota's anti-violence program in April of 2019. As the community access specialist, they work to make sure LGBTQ victim survivors are seen and supported through the provision of crisis intervention services, system advocacy, community education, and outreach. Previously, Alyssa was the legal advocate with Outfront Minnesota, helping victims through the court process and filing for orders for protection. Alyssa attended the University of Minnesota, where they studied communication studies and gender, women, and sexuality studies. They spent a majority of her coursework focusing on barriers to access service, centering disability and LGBTQ identities in that work. Alyssa also worked as a sexual health educator, where their class focused on educating students about healthy relationships, gender identity, sexuality, and consent. In their downtime, Alyssa enjoys traveling, exploring state parks, and making pottery with her cat right by her side. And without further ado, Alyssa, I will let you.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Traci. Good afternoon, everyone. I hope you're having a good Thursday. We're going to go ahead and just jump right in and get started. A few kind of starting points is the poll questions that just got put up. If folks could just go ahead and answer those poll questions and submit those. That's just good information for me to know. Like, where are you? Where have you been? Where y'all in the state? But also just to let y'all know too, that we will have about a 10-minute, 5-minute break, I would say, midway through, just in case you need to grab some more water, take a bio break, whatever you need. If you have questions, pop them in the chat. But yeah, let me get this PowerPoint rocking and rolling. We'll go from here. Okay, so
Alyssa, I'm sorry, Alyssa, I'll end the poll right now. It looks like the majority of folks have voted. And we have a good range of staff and organizations from only me to more than 20. It's about an even split. And then in terms of how long folks have been at their organization, about 40% of our attendees have been less than 1 year, 45% have been 1 to 5, and 15% have been with their organization for 10 plus years. And then 80% of our attendees are from rural Minnesota, 14% are from the metro, and 14% chose other.
Gotcha. Sounds good. So a huge rural group today. That's great. I'll kind of keep that in mind as we're talking about resources and what it looks like to work with clients, not in a metro setting. Okay, so just to jump right in, the little agenda I created today, we're going to first talk about the basics, so language, terminology, what does this stuff mean? We're then going to talk about communities, just talking about our oppressions and our barriers to service. What makes it hard for domestic violence and sexual violence victims to get services if they're also LGBTQ? And go into a little bit more depth. And then where I want to spend just the rest of the time we have together is creating safer spaces. How are we including or increasing our agency's inclusion? What are the next steps? And just get our gears rolling. We're not going to walk away with perfect answers. I'm not expecting anyone to walk away being an expert today. This is just to kind of get your feet wet, answer questions, get you familiar with what's happening for LGBTQ folks. A little bit about Outfront Minnesota before we start. So Outfront is a Minnesota advocacy group. And so we work all throughout the state of Minnesota. We're not just within the metro. Our anti-violence program works with LGBTQ victims of domestic violence, sexual violence, and hate and bias crimes. So we're a little bit broader around like who we can talk with. We have a helpline that we answer Monday through Friday, 9 to 5, and we have extended hours on the evenings of Tuesdays and Thursdays for folks to call in. But yeah, our program is pretty like broad in what we do, and so that can look really different. Okay.
Jay, I'm getting a message that one of our panelists can't hear the audio. Can everybody else hear okay? Okay, it looks like folks can hear. So Alyssa, go ahead and we'll just troubleshoot, okay?
Okay, sounds good. Okay, so language and terminology. Starting off first is sex assigned at birth. So this is just, sex is defined as a category assigned to each of us as birth based on mostly the appearance of our external anatomy. So with that being said, you know, there's male and female are what doctors typically assign folks at birth. I bring this up because there's this concept in this term called intersex. Folks might be familiar with it. It's kind of popping up more in the mainstream lately, but intersex is a term for a variety of conditions in which a person is born with an anatomy that doesn't align with typical male or female anatomy. There's other terms folks can use for it. I'm not going to use those terms today because those aren't, folks have just said that those are offensive terms for them, so I'm not going to say them today. You might know it as something else, but I bring up this concept first and foremost right off the bat because I think it gives us this idea that our anatomy also exists on this spectrum. So there's male on one side, female on the other side, and then there are folks that fall in between all along that spectrum. It's not just an either or situation. So just to kind of get us started, sex assigned at birth. Talking then about gender identity, this is where we get more into like a person's internal sense of themselves, whether they're a man, a woman, both or neither. The term transgender, if folks are familiar with it, it's a term for people whose gender identity differs from the gender that they were assigned at birth. So if somebody was assigned female at birth, but they self-identify as a man and they present as a man, they could use the term transgender man to describe themselves. Another term that folks might also be familiar with is transsexual. That's a term that the older folks in our community like to use, but more and more so folks aren't using that term anymore. And we're opting for transgender just because it's more inclusive. Transsexual is really rooted in like the surgical processes. On the other side, there's this term cisgender, and these are terms for folks whose gender matches the sex that they were assigned at birth. So if a doctor looked at a baby and said, oh, this is a male, and then that baby grew up and decided to be a man and identifies as a man and feels like a man internally, then they would be cisgender. And then there's this term non-binary and gender fluid. These are two different terms, but they have kind of the same category. They're used by people who experience their gender identity or their gender expression outside of these categories of man or woman. So both or neither. They could be both a man and a woman, and it depends on the day for them. It could be I'm not a man or a woman, I'm somewhere in between, or I'm outside of it altogether. Just everybody gets to show up differently, and every person who's non-binary or gender fluid would have an understanding of what that means for them. So it's really self-determined. Okay, so gender expression. I know I said it on the last slide, but gender expression is a term to refer to the way in which a person acts and communicates their gender within our given culture. So we're using Western society as our model. Gender expressions are typically representative of white, cisgender, heterosexual folks, and no other groups. Some ways folks express their gender are their hair, wearing makeup, not wearing makeup, the clothing they choose to wear, the body language they have and they hold, how often they speak up in groups. Sometimes it's the professions that we choose. I maybe preaching to a choir here, but I think a lot of us know that the social services tend to be gendered as a really female field, even if that's not, there are a lot of women in this field, and it's not a feminine job to have. But those are kind of ways that folks can express their gender. It's just what's on the outside, how are they communicating this? And then this term gender nonconforming, or GNC. This is a term for people whose gender expression is different from conventional expectations of masculinity or femininity. A really good example of this is Prince. Love this example because as Minnesotans, we love him, and he's great. He really had a feminine presence on stage. He curled his hair, he wore makeup, he wore glitter and tightening clothing and capes, and was a really feminine and gender non-conforming person, but he was at least out to everyone, he was cisgender and he was straight, and so it's a way that people, these identities don't all have to interact with one another. They can, they don't have to though. And so I think Prince is a great example. But yeah, do I have folks with me so far?
Yep, there are no questions in the chat yet.
Awesome. Okay, so sexual orientation. This is where I think folks are more familiar with the terms of LGBTQ. This is where I think folks have more of an understanding as a baseline. So sexual orientation, it's the romantic, sexual, and or emotional attraction to somebody else. I've got a bunch of terms on the page right now. So some you might have seen, some you maybe have never seen. I'm gonna go ahead and quickly define all of them though. Just a note though, you don't have to memorize them. There's not gonna be a test at the end, but also I'm sending out a packet to everyone. It should have been linked. It's a PDF just explaining identities and breaking down those definitions and having a lot of what I just talked about in depth. So you can kind of dig deeper if you want to go back or if you forget something. That's a really good place to start looking. Okay, so quickly, lesbian. So the term lesbian is a term that women use if they're attracted to other women. The term gay is more of a blanket term now, but it's traditionally been a man who's attracted to another man. But it can also be a blanket term for a community. Bisexual, this is a term for somebody who's attracted to two genders, and so that might be a woman who's attracted to women and men. Bi plus is a term where it's bisexual, but it's also inclusive of maybe more gender non-conforming identities. And so kind of the difference between bisexual and bi plus is like bi plus really puts an emphasis on, oh, there aren't only two genders, there's multiple genders. And I'm attracted to two of them, but it might not be the traditional male and female combination. And kind of then the difference between those two terms and pansexual, folks who identify as pansexual typically identify as being attracted to anyone regardless of gender. So gender is not a factor, totally not a part of it. It's just this other side piece, and they're attracted to just people. So those are the big ones. Those are ones folks tend to be a little more familiar with. The term queer, this one has a lot of weight to it. And so I want to make sure to like give it time. So some folks might have heard that this term is a slur, and they're not wrong if they've heard that. It is a really traditional slur. It's been used for a long time to harm queer people. And within the past 5 to 10 years, the LGBTQ community and the queer community has been really reclaiming this word and taking it back, just because it means a lot to us. It's a word that's like impacted all of us in some kind of way. So queer, to define it, it's both like sexuality. It could both like explain your sexual orientation, but it's also for our community. So it's kind of both of those things at once. Every single person is going to have a different definition of what being queer means to them. I use the term queer for myself, and for me, it just means that my attractions aren't based on gender for me. It feels like a really good term for me, and that's just I'm not straight. And so I guess like a good way to say it, that's kind of what queer can mean for some people, but everyone kind of defines it differently, so it's very individualistic. Yeah, that's kind of the term queer. Term asexual and aromantic, they kind of go hand in hand. Asexual is a term for folks who don't experience sexual attraction to somebody. They may or may not experience romantic attraction. But yeah, it's somebody who's not sexually attracted to other folks. Aromantic, on the other hand, is somebody who doesn't experience romantic attraction. They might experience sexual attraction. They might be both asexual and aromantic. Some folks identify as like asexual, biromantic. Kind of depends. Everybody is different in their own identities, but those are two pieces that go kind of hand in hand. Okay, so demisexual, this is a term for folks who experience sexual attraction, but they only experience it after they have some kind of bond or connection with the person. Everybody has it differently, and experiences that differently. So some folks, it's like, I just need to be friends with this person before I can experience sexual attraction. Some folks, it's I have to have like a year-long commitment to this person before that feels good. And before I have that attraction. So again, super individualistic. Okay. So the next two terms, androsexual and gynosexual, these are ones that folks might not have heard. They're not used super often. And so, yeah, so androsexual is for folks who are attracted to phallics, and then gynosexual are for folks who are attracted to vulvas. And so it's really genital based and really kind of emphasizing that. These aren't terms that are typically used, and they're definitely older terms, but they are terms that folks will use to identify themselves, and so you get to have in your back pocket. And then same gender loving. So folks might be familiar with this term same sex, especially when we're talking about marriage and same-sex rights. We, as a community, I can say, I guess, we've been slowly trying to transition out of that language. So instead of focusing on sex, we're focusing on gender, so same gender loving instead of same sex. But yeah, so that's the rundown for sexual orientation. Lots there. This isn't an entire list. There are more terms being created every day, more ways that folks are using these terms. It's always changing, and I think the best part about that is that folks get to really choose for themselves what these terms mean and find terms that like work for them. And so this isn't all of them. This is a good start, a pretty good base. Okay. And then just to like cap off this intro section, I know it was fast and furious. And so if you have questions, like definitely loop them in the chat. If you want me to go back and explain something more in depth, or if you're confused about something, let me know. But I'll stop, like kind of leave you off this section with this image. So on the screen, the top it says the gender bear, then it has an image of a bear with 4 spectrums next to it. All of the spectrums are titled. The top one is gender identity, correlates to the little brain in the bear's head. And this is how you feel and see yourself. So woman, man, genderqueer, other. You get to find yourself on that spectrum. Sexual orientation correlates with your heart. Who are you attracted to sexually, romantically, physically? The little chromosome is between the bear's legs, and it says sex next to it, so that's your sex assigned at birth. Are you female, intersex, male, somewhere on that spectrum? And then the whole bear, there's a dotted line pointing to the whole bear, and it says gender expression. How do you express yourself? Are you feminine, masculine, or androgynous? An activity I like to do, especially if I'm working with youth or if I'm doing like youth trainings, is to just like spend a moment, like 30 seconds, and place yourself on each of these spectrums. Where do you fall? Are you all the way to one side for something, but like sort of in the middle for another? Are you pretty like mixed on it? This is just a really good way to visualize LGBTQ identities and put them into like a physical space to understand that better. And so I love the gender bear. It was created by a student out in California 10 years ago and has been used ever since, and is just a really great tool. So if you have clients who are working through like coming out and wanting to understand this stuff better, this is a great starting point. Okay. So now we get to talk about the heavy stuff, oppressions, barriers to service. I'm going to slow down for this section. Also just going to give just a content warning of sorts. I'm going to be talking a lot about violences and systemic violences especially. And if there's a point where you need to walk away from your computer, take a break, I really encourage you to do that. This can be heavy stuff. And so, you know, do what you need to do to engage with it. And yeah, please, again, like stop and ask questions if you're confused about something or if you just want to have more conversation about it. Okay. So to start off, when we're thinking about oppressions, we're typically thinking in structures. And so the 2 structural oppressions I want to talk about today, we're familiar with ones like racism, ableism, classism, ageism, these big ones that we all have been taught about, we all know exist, and they're there. And so 2 that maybe either you aren't like, don't have the language for, you don't know, maybe you do know this stuff and I'm just giving you a review, which is also great and very fun, are heterosexism and cissexism. Heterosexism, this is the belief that heterosexuality is the only natural or moral mode of sexual behavior. This belief results in a systems of biases and discrimination against same-sex sexuality and relationships. That structural oppression, heterosexism, results in something called heterosexual privilege or straight privilege existing. This is the actual or promised societal benefits accorded to individuals who identify as heterosexual or relationships perceived as heterosexual. In the chat right now, why don't I have folks, if you can, and if you can think of some, what are some privileges folks who are heterosexual have? kind of the first one that comes to mind for me is the ability to walk down the street holding their partner's hand and not fearing violence. But if you could pop it in the chat, if you can think of one, that'd be great.
And if you're typing in the chat, please go ahead and mark it to all panelists and attendees so that everyone can see you.
Yeah, PDA without fear of being killed, always able to wed up in all of their rights that are contributed to that. Yeah, definitely, that's a big one. Marriage equity and marriage equality wasn't passed until 2015 nationwide. Yeah, if folks have more, feel free to keep popping them up. I'm just gonna get this PowerPoint back to where we were. Yeah, there's lots of privileges that come with being straight. So that's just good to acknowledge that, like, those exist. Those are things that happen. And this is like the name for the system of why straight people have it easier. It's also the ability to, you know, continue to go to your place of worship. It's not always the case for folks if they come out. It's the ability to not be questioned about their relationship from families and friends in ways that are really invasive, like asking, like, there's lots of other privileges that kind of come with it that aren't necessarily as yeah, if homeless able to find shelter, that's a big one. Shelter is a really big part of it. Yeah, so hand in hand with heterosexism, there's this concept called cissexism. It's just the belief that transgender and gender nonconforming identities are inferior and or less valid than cisgender identities. This belief in our culture results in systems of biases and discriminations against transgender, non-binary, and gender nonconforming people. So then what that results in is cisgender privilege. So cis privilege. What do people who are cisgender, what are those promised and actual societal benefits for folks whose gender identity aligns with the sex that they were assigned at birth? I think a big one is they don't have to get their name legally changed. You know, their name might match. In some cases, yeah, they might choose to change their name, but for a lot of trans people, they have to pay lots of fees and go to court and get like a legal process to get their name changed. Another one is like having access to shelter. Trans people don't always get the same access to shelters that cisgender people have for a variety of reasons. Sometimes it's policy, sometimes it's staff not understanding that that's like an accessible and okay thing to do. Yeah, other things, folks can pop it in the chat, any cisgender privileges they can think of. If you are cisgender, what privileges do you have? What are things you don't think about? And that's kind of the hard part of this, right? Is like, this is stuff you probably don't think about on the daily. Okay. But yeah. Yeah, transgender women of color have a life expectancy in their early 30s. Overall, trans people have a really low life expectancy. But yeah, being a woman of color makes that a lot lower. Going to the bathroom in public without look or hate speech. Exactly, that is a huge one. Less access to healthcare. There's so many things that cisgender people have access to, and those privileges exist in a lot of ways. Even as basic as access to healthcare, not having to explain to a doctor the way their body works, like, yeah, dealing with how they pass. Absolutely. There's so much that goes into it. Y'all are getting it. Awesome. All on the same page. So, next, why are these systemic oppressions so big? Why do they matter? The first big thing is it's like leads to laws that are discriminatory, and it leads to like discrimination, period. So I have to change the slide like fully soon, but it's so recent that I think it's worth bringing up. On the screen, there's a map of the US, and it shows all of the states where anti-discrimination laws exist. And so if the state is gray, there are statewide protections for LGBTQ folks when it comes to employers, public accommodations, and housing. So Minnesota's gray. So we've always had, not always, but we've had anti-discrimination LGBTQ protections for a while. If the state is blue, looking at Wisconsin, they had statewide protections, but it was for sexual orientation only. So it didn't cover transgender people. It didn't cover non-binary people, gender non-conforming people could still be fired for being trans in Wisconsin. And if a state is red, there were no protections. There was nothing written to their state legislation saying that LGBTQ people couldn't be fired for being LGBTQ, couldn't be denied housing for being queer. They had no protections. That was 33 states. And just a few weeks ago, the Supreme Court passed the Supreme Court passed protection for LGBTQ folks for employment. And so now it's illegal to discriminate in somebody's work or for hiring if they're LGBTQ. But that is just like super recent. That was a few weeks ago. Before that, there were no protections, and we still are waiting to see how that's going to play out when it comes to housing and public accommodations and everything else down the road. So yeah, kind of a little grounding work. So have these big structures. What does it result in? Individually, it creates these feelings, and it creates these ideas of like homophobia, biphobia, and transphobia. And so these are stereotypes, negative feelings, attitudes, fears, or hatreds of specific groups. For homophobia, it's of lesbian and gay people. For biphobia, it's of bisexual or pansexual or non-monosexual people. And then for transphobia, it's of fear of transgender and gender non-binary people. And so folks have, these are like terms we use all the time to describe somebody's like behavior or attitudes or ideas. Something's homophobic, something's transphobic. So these are, terms that are floating, but they all are rooted in this structural, like this is what our culture is based in. Something to know though, and something to kind of keep as a forefront of our conversations is many LGBTQ people also are marginalized in other communities or have other identities that are also marginalized. There needs to be an approach that sees and values the whole person, and that added marginalization happens especially with youth of color, people with disabilities, and those in economic instability. And so people who don't have housing, people who don't have full-time jobs, people who don't have immigration status, like these oppressions, being LGBTQ on top of those other oppressions can act really differently, can play out really differently. Just something to remember. And then queer and trans communities of color. The combination of transphobia and racism is really devastating for our trans and non-gender conforming people, especially people of color. These folks have a high rate of unemployment, homelessness, they experience harassment, discrimination, violence at rates higher than white transgender people. We see this playing out even in our local news, even with like harms and harassments that have happened in the Twin Cities. But in 2017, there were 28 reported murders of trans people in the US. 80% of those people were trans women of color. And so Alyssa in the chat earlier said that transgender women of color have a life expectancy in their early 30s. A lot of that is because of these hate crimes and these murders and this higher experience of harassment and unemployment and homelessness and economic instability. So yeah, something to really be thinking about, especially in our current moment where we're working to dismantle white supremacy in our organizations and make sure we're focusing on our people of color and the people we're serving and that their services are good and competent. Queer and trans communities of color experience things a lot differently than our white LGBTQ people. And so, yeah. So, all these systems and all this oppression exists. What are the actual impacts? What is happening on a day-to-day in LGBTQ people's lives? Why does this matter? This is going to be a really numbers-heavy thing, but I'm going to talk a little bit about each one of these. Oh, gosh. So poverty, same-sex couples and their children are significantly more likely to be poor than heterosexual married couples. And when we're looking at that, the numbers, this was taken in 2014 from an LGBTQ map, kind of census-style thing that was done. And they found that lesbian couples have a much higher poverty rate than their different-sex couples or gay male couples. Can anybody pop in the chat why they think a lesbian couple is going to have a higher rate of poverty than either straight couple or even a gay male couple? Yep, Samantha got it. Wage gap. As women, like, we earn less than men. And so if you have two women in a relationship, they're both earning less than their, like, probably male counterparts or coworkers, or just statistically across the board, they're earning less. And so they're going to have a higher gap of poverty. And so, yeah, definitely something to think about. Poverty is a huge thing. Drug and alcohol use. A little disclaimer on this one. Being LGBTQ doesn't mean you are a drug user or you abuse alcohol. It doesn't mean you're more likely to do it. It just says that, like, this is happening more often in our community than it is outside of our community. So estimated that 20 to 30% of the LGBTQ population abuses drugs or alcohol compared to 9% of the general population. The best way anybody's ever explained these numbers to me and explained why this is happening is because marginalized identities, folks who experience oppressions like this, who experience harm and hatred in this way, they, in communities, sometimes they'll turn to drugs and alcohol as coping mechanisms. It's as simple as that. And so that's something to understand, that, like, you might have clients who are LGBTQ who are also abusing drugs or alcohol, and it's just something to know that it's more likely in our community. So, and then it also, LGBTQ folks are 200 times more likely to use tobacco than the general population. By this point, it's looking like tobacco companies are targeting people of color, targeting LGBTQ communities, and targeting youth communities, because these are the folks who are using tobacco. And so these are the populations that they're really trying to get hooked and to consume more. And so, you know, tobacco, just the ways that tobacco companies will put convenience stores or tobacco stores really close to schools. They'll also do that, like, close to gay bars, or they'll sell cigarettes in gay bars and in other community spaces that LGBTQ people go to. And so something to know. Yeah. Homelessness. About 40% of the homeless youth served by agencies identify as LGBTQ. 43% of clients served by drop-in centers identify as LGBTQ, and 30% of street outreach clients identify as LGBTQ. To be really honest with you, a big reason that these numbers are so high and so extraordinary is because LGBTQ youth are being kicked out of their homes really young and having to utilize these services and figure this out. Whether it's their family won't accept them, they're afraid their family won't accept them, their school's not accepting them. There's lots of reasons why youth are experiencing homelessness when they're LGBTQ. But the biggest reason is because of family acceptance. So, with that being said, I think it's important to know the ways that homelessness and the ways that having housing security as a youth, or especially a young adult, people who are under 25, can create housing insecurity for a lot longer down the road. And so it's an important one. Homelessness and housing insecurities are huge for LGBTQ youth. And there's some stuff being done to address it, but overall it's a really hard problem to address without the right resources or without the funding. Okay, suicide risks. 39% of LGBT, so the Trevor Project in 2019, Barb just posted in this, tobacco is also used to relieve stress. LGBTQ are definitely no strangers to stress. Yes, absolutely. Same with drugs and alcohol, right? We're told having a drink after work can help you de-stress. And if you're also working all day, but then having to deal with homophobia all day, of course you're gonna turn, that's just a natural thing for a lot of folks. And so, yeah, thank you, Barb. That's a really good point. So fast. So suicide risks. 39% of LGBTQ folks responded to this survey that the Trevor Project did in 2019. And they said that they had seriously considered suicide within the past 12 months. And so the Trevor Project works to serve LGBTQ youth. But this was not a survey specifically of LGBTQ youth. This is just LGBTQ youth, people across age spectrums. And it also found that more than half of transgender and non-binary youth have seriously considered suicide. And so these are pretty startling numbers. Every time I read them, I'm startled, and I'm the one presenting. It's just really hard to think about suicide being an option for LGBTQ folks and being seen as a really common option. But, suicide risks are a lot higher. They're just it's a matter of the fact when working with LGBTQ folks. And so definitely something to think about. And just keep in your mind hate and bias crimes. So hate violence, the way that both Outfront, the state of Minnesota, and the survey defines hate violence. It can range from anywhere from vandalism to ongoing harassment, to bullying, to physical violence or murder. So pretty big range of what it can be. Acts of violence have to be motivated by the perpetrator's prejudices against a specific group of people, in this case, LGBTQ people. Overall, LGBTQ and queer people are 2.5 times more likely to experience a hate crime in their life than any other group. So, 2.5 times more likely to experience hate crimes. It's pretty hot.
Alyssa, we have a question. Can you talk about the youth age range that you're referring to?
Yeah, is that with the suicide risk?
It doesn't say in the chat.
Okay. Well, the most recent I was talking about for like the suicide risk, the Trevor Project works with youth who are 18 and under. They'll also work with youth who are 24 and under. I don't know off the top of my head how they got this specific number. I think it's transgender, non-binary youth who are 18 and under have, about half of them have considered suicide. So that's my best guess, but there's also in the PowerPoint, I can find the link to the project and add it to the PowerPoint so you can see the specific survey. Good question. Okay. So, sexual violence, where we all work, we're advocates, and this is our services. A lot of the sexual violence within the LGBTQ community goes reported, as does a lot of the sexual violence in general. Some studies show LGBTQ, and with that, like we say that because these numbers are probably off because of the lack of the reporting. So some studies show that folks are approximately, LGBTQ folks experience sexual violence at the same rate as heterosexual people. 1 in 4 women, 1 in 8 men. Other studies show that sexual violence is even higher for LGBTQ people. Specifically, 1 in 2 bisexual women and 1 in 2 transgender individuals have experienced sexual violence in their lifetime. So higher than the general rate. But pretty much a good rule of thumb is to understand that LGBTQ folks, it's about the same. Some myths, some things we all heard, some things I believed about LGBT violence and abuse when I started my job, when I started being an adult, things that are just kind of commonplace. That violence in LGBTQ relationships doesn't happen. There are no laws against sexual assault between 2 women or 2 men. That men or masculine folks are never survivors and women and feminine folks are never perpetrators. Or that if 2 women or 2 men are violent with one another, it's a fighting, it's not abuse. So these are things you might hear in agencies. These are things you might hear from advocates, from victims, from officers, whoever's working within the system. These are really common things that folks believe. And the like good thing to know about them all is that all of them are untrue. These are all myths. I mean, as I listed, but yeah, relationship abuse, getting more into IPV. So dating and intimate partner violence occurs at the same rate for LGBTQ people as heterosexual people. So again, 1 in 4 people. There is still research out there that shows trans and bisexual people experience higher rates of violence and higher rates of intimate partner violence as well as sexual assault. So also that 1 in 2. The biggest thing I want to spend time explaining and going through today, this is something that you all can take away with you. Feel free to use. It's by no means Outfront's property, like share this wide. So it's the LGBTQ power and control wheel. Are folks familiar with the power and control wheel? If you are, can you just put yes in the chat? If you're not, can you just put no? Awesome. I'm seeing mostly yeses. Yes, awesome. So we know this beautiful power and control wheel. It's helped us all figure out the ways abuse works and understanding it and getting to visualize it. Maybe you use it with a client. I use them all the time with the clients I work with, and so they're super helpful. But what we've done is we've created a power and control wheel that is specific to LGBTQ people, specific to maybe the harms that happen that are specific to us, things that maybe can only happen to us because of our identities. And it also brings in another ring. So on the outside, the black ring around the power and control wheel says heterosexism, homophobia, biphobia, and transphobia. So we have the power and control wheel. We have all the ways abuse plays out. And on the outside, we have all these external factors impacting us. This homophobia, this heterosexism, this transphobia, everything that's happening outside of that relationship is on top of all the abuse that's happening. But if we get into here and get really close, you can see, especially with the using privilege one, you can see there's some differentiations in the ways that it works. And so one is using privilege or their ability to pass, to discredit you and put you in danger. A big thing that we can see happen when it comes to LGBTQ abuse or abuse to a trans person is somebody lording over their ability to pass. Maybe it's cutting off their hormones. Maybe it's taking away their clothing, not letting them get money to go and get a haircut so that they can continue to pass. Lots of ways that that can play out. You know, it's sometimes outing is a really big thing. So putting that under emotional abuse, you know, threatening to out somebody to their family, to their work, especially prior to having workplace protections, that could be a really big one. You know, sometimes it's humiliating and calling somebody not a real lesbian, not a real man, using terms and hurting somebody with those terms from our community. So these are all, like, you can kind of get into here and really see specifically what these look like, but just like knowing this power and control wheel exists. And when you're working with an LGBTQ client, sometimes it can be helpful to pull this one out. Just say like, what I like to do is see how many of their experiences are on here, or like start helping them name experiences that they don't know are abusive. And so this is really helpful, especially when it comes into like questioning their sexuality, if it's true or not, threatening to out them. A lot of LGBTQ people don't know that that's abuse. So, a helpful tool. So, back into domestic violence. Queer domestic violence victims experience violence and criminalization from the police. This is something I'm sure us as advocates know and are a part of all of our conversations right now as we're figuring out how we're navigating right now. But in 2015, NCAVP did a survey, and 31% of LGBTQ survivors who interacted with police were arrested. So it's about 1 in 3. So yeah, lots of LGBTQ people experience harassment and violence from the police. I can just tell you from the clients' experiences I've had over the past year and a half now, is police not believing them, police saying that if it's 2 women, it's a cat fight, and that they're just fighting, and that it's not domestic violence. Police not following the same protocols that they would for heterosexual victims of separating them and taking a report, or being arrested if they're a transgender person. And why it's so important to know this, I think, when it comes to talking about domestic violence, is because LGBTQ people can have a really hard time and a really bad experience being arrested, working with the police, being questioned. Historically, the police would arrest LGBTQ people just for, they would call it cross-dressing, but just for existing. You could get arrested for sodomy if you were a man and you were sleeping with another man. There's lots of historic trauma between the police and LGBTQ people. And so as you're working with victims of domestic violence, knowing that that historic trauma is there and impacts the ways that victims probably want to interact with the systems is really good. And also just knowing 1 in 3 are arrested when they're interacting with them. It's a good background. Okay, so how does this impact us? What does this lead to? Actually, before I even start talking about barriers to service, what I'm going to do is let's take a 10-minute bio break. Let's meet back here at 3:06, and I'll pick up on barriers to service. I'm going to mute myself and get some more water, but just like get water, use the bathroom, whatever you need to do, stand up and move. We have 30 minutes left of the training, and we're really going to start talking about, okay, now what? What can we all do as providers to make the space better? Okay, so let's go ahead and jump back in. Hopefully that break was helpful for folks. Yeah, we are just going to start talking a little bit about barriers to service. So what do LGBTQ people experience when trying to get served as a victim? I think the first barrier is outing, whether it's outing yourself or outing a partner who's not out. There's a lot of points, especially as like a victim of domestic violence, where outing can be really public, whether you're experiencing like going through court and you're needing to get an order for protection or an HRO, or you need to like tell the other person your partner's name that's harming you, or if you're making a police report. It's not always safe to be out, and there's lots of reasons people choose to not be out. And so that's a big risk that folks have to take and decide if it's worth it to get help if they're in a harmful or abusive place. Stereotypes about LGBTQ people may cause providers to miss issues. And so not knowing the ways that emotional abuse and mental abuse can show up for LGBTQ folks around outing or not being real, a real lesbian, a real man, whatever that looks like. Other stereotypes that exist, like having providers who don't know that, can lead to lots of missed forms of abuse. So something to know about. Fear of homophobic responses from providers is also one. Not all providers are homophobic, and our structures and the areas we work in are not inherently homophobic, but something to think about. I mean, just like first and foremost, the Violence Against Women's Act. It's called the Violence Against Women's Act, and it came from a really important history, and we're not trying to discount it, and I think it's really worth it to know. But that alone, when victims hear that it's called the Violence Against Women's Act, if it's a male victim, they can be really kind of off-put and confused and not know if it actually applies to them or not. Another thing, I think about the ways that I learned to talk about abusers and victims were always to use he, him pronouns for abusers and she, her pronouns for victims. So victim's always a woman, abuser's always a man. There's always some kind of relationship between the two of them. We know that's not the case. We know victims come in all genders and all kinds of relationships, and so do abusers. And but like having those responses, having that fear of having a homophobic response from a provider can be a reason somebody's not going to reach out and not going to come and get a service and get help. Yeah, that heterosexual focused climate. So if you're ever working with somebody and you automatically assume the gender of their partner, that can be a really hard thing to get through and to work through as a client. having to educate providers as the client. It's okay and it's welcome, and all advocates and providers need education around a bunch of different topics, but when it comes from the victim, it can be exhausting and it can be a reason somebody's not going to reach out. We're not going to come back and get more services. Fear of not being taken seriously. I think a lot of victims have it, but especially when it comes to police, a lot of LGBTQ folks have had experiences where the police don't believe them or don't take them seriously because of their identity or the ways they look. What else? Can folks think of other barriers, either that they've heard clients say or things you can think of? Think about the ways your own offices operate. What, now that we're kind of like talking about this and having these conversations, what are other barriers that might exist? We'll just see if any pop up in the chat. If not, we'll move on. Having staff who don't want to educate themselves. Yeah, having staff who don't know how to educate themselves too, that can be really tricky, especially if you're a staff of 2 and you're working out in rural Minnesota. You might not know, other than this standpoint training, because you're here obviously, but like other than this, you might not have known how to get help. Having to disclose gender assigned at birth, yeah, that's also a huge barrier. A lot, like that's outing yourself to a provider and saying that I'm transgender, or having to use your legal name versus your given name. That can be a really big problem in court. I've had 1 or 2 experiences like trying to keep a judge in their place using their given name, because there's nothing illegal about using their given name when having a court proceeding, but that can be a big barrier. And also some advocates don't know that that's the case. So it can also just be hard if an advocate's not like well-versed, and if an advocate doesn't work with a lot of LGBTQ clients, like it can just be tricky to kind of maintain that knowledge and know that they can tell a judge to use the right name or use the right pronouns. Yeah, limited spaces that are LGBTQ specific. Fear of retaliation by perpetrators, their community, and the potential hate crimes. Yeah, that's a huge one. Thanks for posting that one. Retaliation, our LGBTQ community is really tiny when you think about it. I guess like a fun little anecdote to think about it is, I went on a date with a girl once, and it wound up that she grew up best friends with my best friend, and we're all queer, and their 2 exes are also best friends, but we've never all sat in the same room together. Like our community is really tiny at the end of the day. And so a lot of times folks will know each other, and that can be a really huge fear, especially if you don't know what's going to happen if you have to do like a court proceeding. That's like a whole nother thing. Providers asking invasive questions. Sometimes as providers, we have to, if we're doing some kind of work with somebody, we have to ask an invasive question. But like some of them aren't necessary. Sometimes you don't need to know somebody's gender identity or sexuality. And it's beneficial if you do, but sometimes it's not necessary information and you don't need to ask that question. These are all great. These are great examples of like barriers to services we see happening. Another stat, in 2015, NCAVP did a survey. It said 44% of survivors seeking shelter were denied across the US, and 71% reported being denied for reasons relating to gender identity. So the ways they either present their gender or their gender identity itself. And so it's really hard. It's really, really hard for trans people to get shelter. I, a lot of times, am sending my transgender clients out of state to get shelter, or we're doing hotel motel stays for them because shelters won't take them. We all know the benefits of when a victim is able to get into shelter, if they need to go to shelter, and not being isolated. So it's really a bummer that that is such a hard process. And it's something we're working to shift, but yeah, just like something to know, shelter can be a really hard thing for our clients to get access to. Okay. Talked all about domestic abuse, sexual violence, talked all about these oppressions. What can we actually do as providers? We're going to spend the next 15 minutes talking about it and run us right up to the end. Just so folks know. So number one piece of advice I can give is avoid assumptions. Don't assume that all of your clients are heterosexual. Don't assume that sexual orientation based on the gender of their partner. So if a woman walks in with a male partner, don't assume she's straight. The woman walks in with a female partner, don't assume she's a lesbian. Sexual orientation and gender identity based on appearance, so just the way somebody looks. It can be really hard if you're assuming somebody's gay, but I think like where it really plays out is if you're assuming somebody's straight just because of the way they look. There's no way to look gay. I've tried, I've looked it up. Really, it was a joke. It's always hard with Zooms. I don't know if folks like can really get my tone, but yeah, it's just like not assuming folks' identities based on what they're looking like. It's important. Sexual orientation and gender identity is the same as last interaction, so it can change. Somebody might, especially if you're like putting months in between the times you see them, or even if it is just like weeks or days, like their gender identity and sexual orientation can change as often as they want to. And then don't assume LGBTQ people are engaging in risky or criminal behavior. This is an assumption I've seen, especially around working with LGBTQ folks who are experiencing like economic insecurities, assuming that they're engaging in some kind of sex work or abusing drugs or alcohol. While that can be more common in the LGBTQ community, assuming that somebody is doing that just because they're LGBTQ isn't going to help them get the services they need. Okay. Some key attitude and approaches, some things to think about. Be non-judgmental, open, professional, just like you would with any other client, you know? Provide victim-centered care, reflect the victim's language back to them. Meet them where they're at, you know? Some folks don't have all of this language to talk about their sexuality. They might not be able to describe how they're feeling or what that looks like or understand all these forms of abuse being linked to their sexuality. That's okay. Meet them where they're at. That's all you can do. Be an ally, educate yourself, interrupt homophobia, biphobia, and transphobia in your agency when you come across it. That's like a call to action for all of you as you're working in these other agencies and as you're spread out across the state. And you're in rural parts where you might assume that you don't have LGBTQ clients. I guarantee you there are, mostly just because I have a lot of my close queer people in my community are rural and live in rural Minnesota. And so making sure that if you hear like a comment or a joke or anything that you just interrupt it as somebody who's an ally. Some languages. So what are some language shifts we can make to make sure LGBTQ folks know that you're a safe person to talk to and that you're a safe agency? So on the screen's a list of examples. I'm just going to point out my favorite ones. So saying partner instead of boyfriend or girlfriend, especially if we're talking about some form of relationship violence or sexual violence. You know, even just using the term boyfriend or girlfriend outside of being LGBTQ friendly, it can be hard because that relationship might be changing rapidly and that term might like bring up a lot of feelings for them. So just using partner. Saying parent or guardian instead of mother or father, saying person instead of man or woman, and then saying they instead of he or she. That's a great one to start with. Some visual safety cues, signs, posters, magazines, having a gender neutral bathroom or an all gender bathroom, super important. Or if you can't have one in your building, and I know COVID times, I don't know how many of us are actually working out of our buildings, but if you can't have a gender neutral bathroom, knowing where one is, even if it's like building next door, across the street, down the street, at the gas station, like knowing where there's a gender neutral bathroom is really important. Intake forms, that's a huge one. That's like most of the time the first thing a client is seeing and doing with you. And so making sure you ask somebody's pronouns on that intake form, making sure, you know, you have a spot for somebody to put their, like, you can use the terms either legal name and preferred name, or like, those are just like the terms I like to use, so that you know what to call them instead of what their legal name is. You know, having forms can just be a really big thing. It's like the first big step that folks take with you. Other ideas, and pop them in the chat. Let's see what are some other, whether they're visual safety cues, or other, you know, things to do. What are some other things that y'all can do as providers? Oops. One example might be having a physical copy of the LGBTQ power and control wheel close where a victim can see it if they're LGBTQ. Having a pride flag hanging up, that's a huge one. I was working at Hennepin County a while ago, and there's a long history of hanging up the pride flag in their domestic abuse service center, but that I know goes a really long way for clients, and I've had a lot of clients tell me how important it is to see that, and just to know that, like, oh, this is a space that, like, will hear me out. What are some other ways, though? Or I guess better, yeah, are there any issues with, sorry, I don't know what just happened and why it just, folks can't see my slideshow, can they, anymore?
I can see the visual safety cues.
Okay, great.
And we also did have a comment in the chat that you can have a list of current support groups.
Yes, that's a great one. Knowing what support groups are out there. You know, you can have Outfront brochures. Knowing that you can always refer clients to Outfront, or you can work in tangent with us. I am more than happy to work alongside you if you have questions. As an advocate, or yeah, just like as an advocate or something like that, that's like really important to know where support groups are, but like I'll work alongside of you to figure that out. Okay, I'm gonna stop. Okay, so if there's nothing else that folks can think of, oh, preferred pronoun button on your desk by your name badge, adding your preferred pronouns to email signatures. Yes, I love that one. There's also, just for folks to know, if you go to outfront.com, if you even just Google outfront.com/preferred pronouns, there's a page where you can link it in your email. You can just write "what's this" and hyperlink to it, and it will explain why your preferred pronouns are in your email, and all of that. Okay, see a little question. Andrew, that's a great question. So Andrew asked, said it's difficult finding current stats and studies on LGBTQ community members. Do I know of any studies around sexual assault and IPV for LGBTQ community members that are going to be released soon? No. The tricky thing is when it comes to counting LGBTQ people, when it comes to surveying them, we have to rely on folks who are getting services. And we know that LGBTQ people are getting less services than heterosexual people. And we also know heterosexual people are also, like, not everybody is reporting, not everybody is getting services. I don't know of any stats that are coming out recently. I think the best place to stay up to date with, like, stats around this are the National AVP program, so NCAVP, and then also the Trevor Project. Those are just like the two best and biggest stats, and they have the most resources for doing that. So that's a good question, Andrew. Alexis, yes. There's a link to the PowerPoint in the chat right now, so feel free to download it and save it. Let me see what time it is, and so I can start wrapping up. So, wrap up, things to remember. LGBTQ people are all over Minnesota. We're way up in the Iron Range. We're down in South Minnesota. We're in the metro, but we're not just in the metro. We're everywhere. We experience domestic violence and sexual violence at about the same, maybe a little bit higher of a rate than heterosexual people. We face unique barriers to services, but there are a lot of concrete things you can do. And so, with that all being said, thank you. What questions do y'all have? I see somebody's asking for me to post a power and control wheel. I can send that over to Traci and Jay after this presentation, and they can put it in the Dropbox, I think. Does that work?
Yes, we can do that.
Awesome. I'll do that so that that will be there. Any other questions? Okay, feel free to stay on. I'm gonna stay on for probably the next like 10 minutes, and I can answer questions folks have. But if you also don't wanna stay and ask questions right now, on the screen, you have my direct number as well as my email address. Please reach out to me. If you want brochures, if you want pamphlets, if you want to just talk about creating some kind of referral system, let me know. I would love to talk with you. But thank you so much for engaging and bearing with me. Zoom trainings are tricky, but I hope y'all took at least something away from this, and I really appreciate you giving me your time today. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Alyssa. And folks, we'll just send out the recording and the handouts when those are done to the listserv. Thanks, everyone.